My name is Sarah Whitehorse, and I'm writing this from Phoenix, Arizona, built on Akimel O'odham and Tohono O'odham land, where I live as a Navajo woman whose very existence is constantly questioned, erased, and made invisible by a nation that would prefer Native Americans remain historical curiosities rather than acknowledge us as living people with ongoing claims to land, sovereignty, and justice. At 31, I've spent my entire life navigating the contradiction of being indigenous in America, simultaneously hypervisible as exotic stereotype, mascots, Halloween costumes, spirit animal, appropriation, and completely invisible as actual person with contemporary existence, political demands, and legal rights that threaten the foundational myths of American legitimacy. I face constant challenges to prove my identity from tribal enrollment offices using blood quantum requirements designed to make us disappear, from diversity initiatives that discuss minorities without mentioning indigenous people, from people who say, "You don't look native," as if their imagination determines my existence, and from a society that has mastered the art of eliminating native people without acknowledging it's still happening. The identity questioning began in childhood when I realized that being Native American meant my very existence would be constantly doubted, challenged, and subjected to scrutiny that no other racial identity faced. Unlike Black, Latino, Asian, or white identities that were accepted based on physical appearance, family background, or self-identification, my Native identity required documentation, tribal enrollment, blood quantum verification, and constant defense against people who assumed they knew what real Indians looked like and that I didn't match their imagination. The "you don't look native" comments started early and never stopped, from teachers, classmates, strangers, employers, and even other Native people who had internalized the same narrow stereotypes about what indigenous people should look like. Because I have lighter skin than the Hollywood Indian stereotype, because I don't wear traditional clothing daily, because I live in a city rather than a reservation, because I don't match the frozen-in-time image that America prefers for Native people, my identity is treated as suspect and requiring proof that other racial identities aren't subjected to. The blood quantum nightmare is unique to Native American identity, a system invented by the federal government to determine who qualifies as Indian enough to be enrolled in tribes and access treaty rights, services, and legal status as Native person. My tribal enrollment with the Navajo Nation required proving I had sufficient blood quantum, meaning I had to document that enough of my ancestors were on tribal rolls to meet the minimum percentage threshold, a requirement that no other racial or ethnic group faces and that was explicitly designed to ensure that eventually no one would qualify as Native, completing the genocide through bureaucratic elimination. The tribal enrollment challenges happened when I tried to enroll my daughter and discovered that because her father is not Native, she doesn't meet the blood quantum requirements for Navajo enrollment despite being my child and being raised in Navajo culture with knowledge of our language, traditions, and community. The blood quantum system means that by marrying outside the tribe, I have potentially eliminated my children from official Native identity regardless of their cultural connection, a form of genocide by policy that ensures eventual elimination of legally recognized Native people even as we continue to exist culturally. The diversity erasure happens constantly in discussions about minorities, people of color, and diversity initiatives that mention Black, Latino, Asian, and sometimes Middle Eastern people but completely omit Native Americans as if we don't exist or aren't relevant to conversations about racial justice. When I point out Indigenous erasure in diversity contexts, people often look confused or say things like, "Oh, I forgot about Native Americans," treating our absence from their consciousness as innocent oversight rather than systematic erasure that continues colonial elimination. The educational invisibility characterized my entire schooling experience as American history classes taught about Native Americans exclusively in past tense, as if we all died or disappeared centuries ago rather than acknowledging indigenous peoples' continued existence and contemporary struggles. The curriculum jumped from "Indians helped pilgrims" to "westward expansion" to "everyone assimilated" without ever mentioning ongoing indigenous presence, sovereignty struggles, or the fact that we never disappeared but were actively eliminated through genocide that American schools refused to name. The healthcare access barriers reflect broader erasure as the Indian Health Service is chronically underfunded. Native people face health disparities worse than any other group including lowest life expectancy and highest suicide rates. Yet these crises receive virtually no public attention or policy response because acknowledging ongoing indigenous health crises would require acknowledging ongoing colonialism and federal responsibility for treaty obligations that guarantee healthcare but chronically fail to provide adequate services. The housing and poverty invisibility means that while statistics show Native Americans have the highest poverty rates, worst housing conditions, and most severe economic challenges of any demographic group, this information is rarely discussed in public discourse about poverty and inequality. The grinding poverty on many reservations exists in deliberate invisibility, allowing Americans to consume Native culture through sports mascots, Halloween costumes, and New Age appropriation while ignoring the actual material conditions of indigenous people whose land was stolen to build American wealth. The mascot dehumanization represents the most visible form of contemporary erasure as sports teams use Indians, Chiefs, Braves, and other Native references while actual Native people object and are ignored, told we're being too sensitive, or informed that the mascots actually honor us despite the fact that no other racial group would tolerate their identities being used as entertainment mascots. The mascots allow Americans to consume simulated Native identity while ignoring or dismissing actual Native people's objections, voices, and humanity. The cultural appropriation epidemic happens constantly as non-Native people adopt Native aesthetics, practices, and identities for personal benefit, wearing headdresses to music festivals, claiming Native ancestry without tribal connection to access benefits, selling Native-inspired products without indigenous input or profit sharing, practicing shamanism, taught by white people, and generally treating Native culture as public domain free for consumption while actual Native people remain invisible and our objections are dismissed as gatekeeping. The fake identity phenomenon is rampant as people claim Native American ancestry without any tribal connection, documentation, or cultural knowledge, often citing a Cherokee grandmother that genealogical research proves never existed, claiming Native identity to access diversity benefits in college admissions or employment, or identifying as Native because they feel spiritual connection to indigenous practices they learned from non-Native sources. The ease with which non-Native people claim and are accepted as Native stands in stark contrast to the constant challenges to my documented, enrolled, culturally connected identity. The land acknowledgement superficiality has become trendy as institutions begin events by acknowledging they're on stolen indigenous land, but these acknowledgements rarely translate into material support for indigenous communities, return of land, or meaningful addressing of ongoing colonialism. The land acknowledgements often feel like ways to appear progressive while doing nothing to address actual indigenous needs or demands, performing recognition while maintaining erasure. The sovereignty violation continues as federal and state governments regularly violate tribal sovereignty, break treaties, ignore indigenous legal rights, and prioritize corporate interests over Native communities. From pipeline projects threatening indigenous water and sacred sites to jurisdiction disputes denying tribal authority to environmental destruction of indigenous lands justified by economic development. The ongoing treaty violations receive minimal attention because acknowledging them would require confronting how American wealth and power rest on stolen land and broken promises. The environmental racism targeting indigenous communities is severe as reservations and indigenous lands are disproportionately selected for toxic waste dumps, mining operations, pipeline routes, and other environmentally destructive projects, with indigenous objections dismissed or overridden by corporate and government interests. The environmental destruction serves double elimination purpose, making indigenous lands unlivable while also destroying the natural resources and sacred sites that sustain indigenous cultural practices and connection to land. The suicide crisis in Native communities is catastrophic, with suicide rates for Native youth far exceeding any other demographic group, but this crisis receives virtually no national attention or policy response. The suicide epidemic reflects accumulated trauma from ongoing colonialism, poverty, lack of opportunity, cultural destruction, and the erasure that makes young Native people feel their existence doesn't matter because broader society acts like they don't exist. The breaking silence moment came when I participated in protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock, where I witnessed both the power of indigenous resistance bringing together tribes from across the continent and the violence with which the state responds to indigenous assertion of sovereignty and rights. The militarized response to peaceful water protectors revealed that indigenous resistance is still treated as threat requiring suppression rather than as legitimate exercise of treaty rights and sovereignty. The community organizing work that emerged from Standing Rock includes connecting with indigenous activists and organizations working on varied issues, from missing and murdered indigenous women to language revitalization to land back campaigns to climate justice, And recognizing that all these struggles connect to fundamental issue of indigenous erasure and elimination that continues through varied mechanisms but serves consistent colonial purpose of removing native people from land, resources, and political power. The therapy that helped me process the trauma of erasure was with Dr. Noreen Begay, a Navajo psychologist who specialized in indigenous historical trauma and understood that the challenges to my identity, the constant invisibility, and the ongoing colonialism weren't just individual struggles but reflected systematic genocide that operates through erasure rather than explicit violence but serves the same eliminatory purpose that characterized historical genocide. Indigenous erasure is a continuation of genocide through different means. Instead of overt killing, it's cultural destruction, identity elimination, bureaucratic barriers to recognition, and societal invisibility that makes native people disappear without acknowledgement that this is intentional elimination, Dr. Begay explained during one of our sessions. The blood quantum system was designed to ensure eventual elimination of legally recognized native people. The educational erasure teaches that we disappeared rather than that we were eliminated and continue to be eliminated. The diversity erasure excludes us from conversations about racial justice. All of these mechanisms serve the same purpose, removing indigenous claims to land, sovereignty, and justice by making indigenous people disappear. She helped me understand that my anger was appropriate response to ongoing genocide, that fighting for visibility and recognition was survival work rather than just identity politics, and that healing required both individual processing of trauma and collective resistance to erasure through asserting continued indigenous presence, demanding recognition, and refusing to disappear as colonialism intends. The visibility advocacy work includes calling out indigenous erasure when I encounter it, demanding inclusion in diversity initiatives, educating people about contemporary indigenous issues rather than just historical injustice, and asserting indigenous presence in spaces that pretend we don't exist. The work is exhausting but necessary because every time I'm visible as Native person challenging erasure, I'm refusing the elimination that blood quantum, educational invisibility, and societal erasure are designed to achieve. The language revitalization work with my Navajo community includes learning and teaching Dine Bizad to ensure our language survives despite deliberate destruction through boarding schools and cultural suppression. Language is central to cultural survival, and revitalization efforts resist the linguistic genocide that aim to eliminate indigenous languages as part of broader elimination of indigenous people. The youth mentorship includes supporting young Native people who face the same identity challenges, erasure, and invisibility that I experienced, helping them understand that the challenges to their existence reflect colonialism rather than their inadequacy, and providing the validation and support that can help prevent the suicide crisis by making young Native people know that their existence matters despite society's erasure. Today, I continue fighting for indigenous visibility and recognition, while also working on practical issues affecting Native communities, supporting missing and murdered Indigenous women advocacy, participating in environmental justice campaigns protecting Indigenous lands, advocating for proper funding for Indian Health Service, and working toward land-back initiatives that return stolen land to Indigenous stewardship. The work connects visibility to material justice, recognizing that being seen is necessary but insufficient without addressing ongoing colonialism. The daughter's identity includes teaching her Navajo culture, language, and history despite the fact that blood quantum requirements may prevent her tribal enrollment, refusing to let bureaucratic elimination erase her indigenous identity and connection. She will know she is Navajo regardless of enrollment status, and she will understand that colonial policies designed to eliminate us don't determine our existence or worth. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Therapy with Indigenous providers who understand historical trauma and ongoing colonialism helps process erasure and develop resistance strategies. Indigenous organizing networks connect activists working on varied issues, all reflecting fundamental struggles against erasure and elimination. Visibility advocacy calling out Indigenous erasure in diversity initiatives, education, media, and public discourse challenges systematic invisibility. Language revitalization work resists linguistic genocide and maintains cultural practices central to Indigenous identity and community. Youth mentorship provides validation and support that can help prevent suicide crisis by affirming young Native people's existence matters. Environmental justice campaigns protect Indigenous lands from destruction while asserting ongoing Indigenous presence and sovereignty. Missing and murdered Indigenous women advocacy addresses gender-specific violence targeting Native women while demanding governmental accountability. Land back initiatives work toward return of stolen land to Indigenous stewardship, addressing fundamental colonial theft. Today, when people say, "I didn't know Native Americans still existed," or "I forgot about Native Americans," in diversity discussions, I respond that our invisibility is intentional elimination continuing genocide through erasure rather than explicit violence, that blood quantum requirements were designed to make us disappear bureaucratically, that educational erasure teaches we're extinct rather than that we were eliminated, and that our continued existence despite centuries of genocide is resistance requiring daily fight against erasure. We're still here on stolen land demanding recognition, justice, and the return of what was stolen, and our refusal to disappear despite American investment in our elimination is itself an act of survival and resistance.